Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Titanic disaster and why you absolutely, positively would not have made it off that ship alive. Before you start mentally planning your clever escape route involving doors and hypothermia, let me burst that bubble right now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Bonus points if you're watching this on a boat, because that's either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. One that hopefully ends better than our subjects did. Let's start with the biggest misconception about the Titanic sinking. Everyone thinks they would have been Jack Dawson, charming their way into first class, winning poker games and drawing French girls like their lives depended on it. In reality, you would have been more like the guy who got hit by the falling smokestack, except without the dramatic timing. This wasn't a romantic adventure where love conquers all and doors float conveniently. It was a floating city of class, warfare, terrible decision-making, and the kind of bureaucratic incompetence that would make modern airport security look efficient. You wouldn't have been the hero of this story. You would have been a statistic with a name nobody remembers, assuming they even bothered to fish your body out of the Atlantic. 1912 was the golden age of hold my beer and watch this engineering. The Edwardian era wasn't some elegant time of top hats and proper manners. It was an era of industrial hubris where wealthy men built increasingly ridiculous monuments to their own egos and called it progress. The North Atlantic wasn't a peaceful cruise route. It was a treacherous highway where icebergs lurked like nature's own traffic cones. Except these traffic cones could sink a ship and kill 1,500 people. The White Star Line controlled luxury ocean travel, and their idea of safety regulations was basically, well, it's really big, so probably nothing bad will happen. If you thought Victorian safety standards were thorough, think again. These were the same people who thought asbestos was a miracle. Material and radium made excellent health drinks. The shipping industry operated on the principle that bigger meant safer, which is like saying a larger target is harder to hit. The class system wasn't just about fancy dining rooms and better beds. It was a literal matter of life and death. Third-class passengers weren't just paying less for their tickets. They were paying to be treated like cargo with a pulse. The gates separating the classes weren't just for show. They were physical barriers that would trap people below decks. When the ship started its final plunge, and if you think the crew would prioritize saving lives over following protocol, well, you clearly haven't worked in customer service. Meet Captain Edward Smith, a man so confident in his abilities that he planned to retire after this voyage, which, spoiler alert, he absolutely did, just not in the way he intended. Smith was known as the Millionaire's captain, which should have been everyone's first red flag. Any captain whose primary qualification is being popular with rich people probably isn't the guy you want navigating through an ice field. But Smith wasn't just overconfident. He was operating under the delusion that the Titanic was unsinkable. Not very safe or well-built, but literally unsinkable. As if the laws of physics had taken a holiday and decided to make an exception for really expensive boats. The ship's designers had created watertight compartments, and everyone convinced themselves that this made the ship invincible. It was like wearing a helmet made of paper and calling yourself immortal. Smith received multiple ice warnings throughout the day, but decided to maintain full speed because, apparently, icebergs were more of a suggestion than an actual hazard. One passenger allegedly complained that the ship wasn't going fast enough, which is like complaining that your taxi driver isn't drunk enough. Smith's response to increasing danger was essentially, what's the worst that could happen? A question. that the universe answered with devastating enthusiasm. And if you think that's impressively poor judgment, wait until you hear about how they handled the lifeboats, which makes modern airline boarding procedures look like a masterclass in efficiency. This wasn't just about a boat hitting some ice. This was about a floating microcosm of society where your survival depended entirely on how much money you had spent on your ticket. The wealthy passengers had access to lifeboats, warm clothes, and crew members who actually cared whether they lived or died. Everyone else had access to panic, freezing water, and the comforting knowledge that they had paid good money for the privilege of drowning in alphabetical order. The tragedy revealed the brutal mathematics of disaster. There simply weren't enough lifeboats for everyone, and the ones they had were launched half empty because apparently, even in a life or death situation, people couldn't be bothered to fill them to capacity. It was a perfect storm of human incompetence, class warfare, and the kind of bureaucratic thinking that prioritizes procedures over people. But Captain Smith's overconfidence was just the beginning. The real story lies in how a ship designed to be unsinkable became a floating monument to human arrogance, and how your chances of survival had less to do with luck and everything to do with your bank account. Before we drift off to sleep, let me share some stories that didn't make it into the Hollywood version of events. Tales that reveal the true absurdity of human behavior when faced with the impossible task of maintaining dignity while one's floating palace transforms into an underwater tourist attraction. Consider the story of Colonel Archibald Gracie, a first-class passenger who spent his final hours aboard the Titanic not panicking or praying, but conducting what he called social observations of how people behaved during disasters. Gracie was essentially taking notes on the apocalypse like he was attending a particularly interesting dinner party. He later wrote a book about his experiences, which means he survived a maritime disaster and decided the logical next step was to become a disaster tourism author. Gracie's dedication to documentation during his near-death experience suggests either remarkable intellectual curiosity or complete disconnection from the reality that he was about to become fish food. Then, there's the curious case of the ship's cat, Jenny, who had given birth to kittens shortly before the voyage and was kept aboard to control rats. Jenny apparently possessed better survival instincts than most of the human passengers. She moved her kittens off the ship before it departed Southampton, which was either remarkable feline intuition or proof that even cats are better at risk assessment than maritime engineers. The crew took Jenny's evacuation as a bad omen, but decided to sail anyway because apparently they trusted human judgment over cat judgment, which in hindsight seems like a questionable decision-making hierarchy. Perhaps, most absurdly, several passengers complained about the temperature of the lifeboats and requested blankets, which was like complaining about the thread count of life preservers. Mrs. J. Stewart White, a first-class passenger, later testified that her lifeboat experience was most uncomfortable, and that she had been treated badly by the crew members who were trying to save her life. This suggests that even during life-threatening emergencies, some people maintain their standards for customer service, which is either admirably consistent or evidence that extreme wealth creates expectations that survival situations cannot reasonably meet. The ship's postal workers continued sorting mail even as the mailroom flooded, which was either dedicated public service or proof that government employees will follow their job descriptions during the actual end of the world. They moved hundreds of sacks of mail to higher decks, not because the mail was particularly important in the context of everyone dying, but because that's what postal workers do. All 3 postal workers died, making them either heroes of customer service or casualties of excessive bureaucratic dedication. Most tellingly, several passengers returned to their cabins to retrieve valuables after being told to evacuate, which suggests that people will risk death for jewelry and documents even when survival should be their only priority. This behavior reveals something fundamental about human psychology. We're so attached to our possessions that we'll literally choose potentially fatal detours to collect things that become worthless when we're dead. The financial aspects of the Titanic disaster reveal how economic considerations influenced every aspect of the tragedy, from the initial design decisions to the final survivor payments. The ship cost $7.5 million to build, which was approximately $200 million in today's money, making it one of the most expensive floating objects ever created for the purpose of impressing passengers and subsequently sinking in the North Atlantic. The passenger fares created a literal price hierarchy for survival chances. First-class suites cost up to $4,350, which was more than most people earned in 4 years, and essentially purchased priority access to lifeboats along with fancy dinners. Third-class tickets cost as little as $15, which bought passengers the privilege of being locked below decks during the evacuation. The survival rates corresponded almost exactly to ticket prices, which means the Titanic disaster was essentially a demonstration of how economic inequality can be measured in corpses per dollar spent. Insurance payouts revealed the true value that society placed on different types of passengers. The Astors received substantial settlements, while many third-class families received nothing more than condolence letters and bills for luggage that had accompanied their deceased relatives to the ocean floor. The White Star Line's insurance policy covered the ship but not the passengers, which was either shrewd business planning or evidence that shipping companies considered human cargo less valuable than the vessels that carried them. The economic impact extended beyond individual losses to include the complete transformation of maritime insurance, safety regulations, and liability law. The disaster cost the shipping industry millions in additional safety equipment and regulatory compliance, which proved that preventing disasters was significantly more expensive than allowing them to happen and paying settlements afterward. Perhaps most ironically, the Titanic disaster became profitable for everyone except the people who died in it. Books, movies, documentaries, and tourist expeditions have generated hundreds of millions in revenue from the story of 1500. People dying because they trusted marketing materials about unsinkable ships. The wreck site has become a tourist destination that generates more annual revenue than the ship ever did during its brief career as a functional vessel, which means the Titanic has been more economically successful as an underwater monument than it ever was as a luxury liner. The stories of children aboard the Titanic reveal both the worst and best of human nature during disasters, from systematic exclusion based on social class to remarkable acts of protection and sacrifice that transcended economic barriers. Lorraine Allison, a 2-year-old first-class passenger, became separated from her parents during the evacuation and was the only child from first or second class to die in the disaster. Her story reveals how even wealth and privilege couldn't guarantee survival when families became separated in the chaos. Meanwhile, her baby brother Trevor survived because he was carried to a lifeboat by their nurse, which suggests that sometimes the people paid to care for children are more effective at saving them than their actual parents. The third-class children faced systematic barriers that had nothing to do with their age and everything to do with their parents' ticket prices. The Sage family's 9 children all died because locked gates prevented them from reaching the boat deck, while the Asplund family lost 3 of their 5 children for the same reason. These deaths weren't tragic accidents. They were the predictable result of safety policies that treated poor children as less worthy of rescue than wealthy adults. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the story of the unnamed baby found among the debris, who couldn't be identified because third-class passenger records were incomplete and families had been separated during the chaos. The baby was buried in Halifax with a headstone reading "Unknown Child," which became a symbol of how the disaster had reduced human beings to anonymous casualties of institutional failure. Yet there were also remarkable stories of protection that crossed class lines. Several crew members died trying to help children reach safety, and some passengers gave up their lifeboat seats to families with children. These acts of sacrifice suggest that while systematic inequalities determined overall survival patterns, individual moments of humanity could transcend economic barriers even during the worst disasters. The children's stories remind us that the Titanic disaster wasn't just about engineering failure or regulatory inadequacy. It was about how adult decisions and social systems determined which children would live to grow up and which would become permanent residents of the North Atlantic ocean floor. The ship's crew faced impossible choices between following their training, obeying orders, and saving lives during the final hours, creating individual stories of heroism, confusion, and tragic dedication to duty that reveal how professional obligations can become deadly during emergencies. The engineering crew stayed at their post to maintain power and pumps until the very end, which was either heroically dedicated or proof that some people will follow their job descriptions during the actual apocalypse. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his entire engineering staff died at their stations, keeping the lights on and the wireless operating while the ship sank around them. They weren't heroes by choice. They were victims of a system that required them to choose between abandoning their posts and abandoning their lives. The ship's musicians created the most famous example of professional dedication becoming a death sentence. Wallace Hartley's band continued playing for over 2 hours, not because they were heroically sacrificing themselves for passenger morale, but because they were following their contracts, which required them to perform during emergencies. Their deaths transformed the routine employment obligation into the most romanticized aspect of the disaster, which suggests that people prefer to view systematic failures as individual heroism. The deck crew faced the impossible task of launching lifeboats from a tilting ship using equipment they had never operated under emergency conditions. Many had been trained on different ships with different systems, which meant they were improvising solutions to mechanical problems while passengers died waiting for evacuation. Their struggles with the davits and loading procedures weren't incompetence. They were the predictable result of an industry that provided minimal emergency training while expecting crew members to perform complex operations during life-threatening situations. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, continued sending distress signals until the radio room flooded, which was either dedicated communication service or evidence that some people will maintain customer service standards during disasters. Phillips died at his post, while Bride survived by luck and proximity to flotation devices rather than any reward for his professional dedication. These crew stories reveal how the maritime industry had created a system where following orders and maintaining professional standards could become death sentences during emergencies, transforming routine employment into involuntary martyrdom for institutional failures that crew members had neither created nor controlled. The rescue operation by the RMs Carpathia revealed new levels of organizational confusion and social awkwardness, as survivors were pulled from lifeboats and forced to confront the reality that they had survived something that had killed 1,500 other people, including many who had been wealthier, more important, or more deserving of survival. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia became an instant hero for racing through an ice field to reach the disaster site, which was either admirably brave seamanship or evidence that some people learn from other people's mistakes better than others. Rostron's crew performed competently during the rescue, which suggests that emergency response training was possible if ship operators were willing to invest in it, though this lesson came too late to save anyone from the Titanic. The survivors faced the bizarre task of explaining to other passengers why they were aboard the Carpathia wearing evening clothes and life jackets while covered in blankets and trauma. Many had lost everything except their lives, which created the surreal situation of wealthy passengers becoming refugees who had to depend on the charity of people who had paid significantly less for their tickets on a ship that hadn't sunk. The social dynamics aboard the rescue ship revealed how disaster survival created new hierarchies that had nothing to do with wealth or social position. Titanic survivors became celebrities regardless of their original class, while Carpathia passengers became spectators to the most exclusive disaster in maritime history. Some survivors complained about the accommodations aboard the rescue ship, which suggests that near-death experiences don't automatically create gratitude or perspective. Perhaps most absurdly, several survivors immediately began planning lawsuits against the White Star Line, which was either practical financial planning or evidence that some people respond to trauma by hiring lawyers. The legal proceedings that followed would last for years and generate more paperwork than the Titanic had carried mail, transforming a maritime disaster into a bureaucratic industry that employed more people than the original ship ever had. The rescue operation's success in saving 710 people was celebrated as a triumph, though it might be more accurately described as a partial mitigation of a completely preventable disaster. Let's talk about the class system aboard the Titanic, which wasn't just about having different colored napkins at dinner. It was a carefully orchestrated hierarchy that would literally determine who got to keep breathing and who got to become fish food. Unlike our modern pretense that all passengers are treated equally, the Titanic was designed as a floating feudal system where your ticket price determined not just your comfort level, but your actual chances of seeing another sunrise dot the ship. Was divided into 3 distinct worlds. First class, where wealthy passengers enjoyed amenities that would make modern cruise ships jealous. Second class, which was comfortable but not opulent. And third class, which was basically a floating tenement building with the added excitement of being surrounded by deadly ocean. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just marketing categories. They were physical, legal, and social barriers that would become literal life and death divisions when the ship started sinking. The White Star Line had perfected the art of segregation, creating a ship where the wealthy could pretend the poor didn't exist, except when they needed someone to shovel coal or serve dinner. First-class passengers had their own promenades, dining rooms, smoking lounges, and even their own entrance to the lifeboats. It was like building a floating country club that happened to transport people across the ocean as a purpose side business. This system developed because the shipping industry had figured out that rich people would pay enormous sums for the privilege of not having to see poor people, while poor people would pay whatever they could scrape together for the chance to reach America. It was capitalism at its most brutally efficient, maximizing profit by literally stacking human beings in order of their net worth. Take the story of the Millionaire family, who had booked the most expensive suite on the ship. George Millionaire was so wealthy that he collected rare books as a hobby, which is like using $100 bills as napkins. The Millionaires had their own private promenade, personal steward, and enough room to host dinner parties while crossing the Atlantic. When the ship started sinking, they had immediate access to lifeboats, crew assistance, and warm clothes. Mrs. Millionaire and her maid survived. Mr. Millionaire and his son did not, but they died as gentlemen, reportedly helping others into lifeboats while wearing their finest evening wear. Contrast this with the Sage family. Annie Sage and her 9 children were traveling in third class, having sold everything they owned for the chance at a new life. In America, they were crammed into a tiny cabin with 4 bunks for 11 people, which makes modern airline seating look spacious. When the ship hit the iceberg, the Sage family faced locked gates, no crew assistance, and a labyrinthine route to the upper decks that would have challenged a marathon runner, let alone a mother with 9 children in tow. Not a single member of the Sage family survived. All 11 of them perished, and Annie Sage's body was never recovered. The contrast gets even more absurd when you consider the Astors. John Jacob Astor IV was worth roughly $87 million in 1912 money, which translates to about $2.6 billion today. He was traveling with his pregnant wife, and when the ship started sinking, crew members practically carried them to the lifeboats. Astor helped his wife into a lifeboat, asked if he could join her because she was pregnant, was told no because of the women and children first policy, and reportedly responded with something like, "Well, that's inconvenient." He then lit a cigarette and waited to die like a gentleman, which is either admirably stoic or proof that extreme wealth makes people weird. Meanwhile, in third class, passengers like Eugene Daly were fighting their way through locked gates and flooded corridors. Daly later testified that crew members were actively preventing third-class passengers from reaching the boat deck, not out of malice, but because they were following company policy that prioritized first-class passenger comfort over third-class passenger survival. One officer allegedly told a group of third-class passengers to go back down where you belong, which is probably the most honest thing anyone said during the entire disaster. The numbers tell the real story. 62% of first-class passengers survived. 41% of second-class passengers made it. And only 24% of third-class passengers lived to see another day. But here's the kicker. The survival rate for first class men was actually higher than the survival rate for third-class children. Let that sink in, if you'll pardon the expression. Wealthy men had better odds of survival than poor children, which tells you everything you need to know about how the women and children first policy actually worked in practice. But it wasn't that simple, because human nature is never that straightforward. The class system created bizarre contradictions that would have been comedic if they weren't so tragic. Some wealthy passengers died because they were too polite to push their way onto lifeboats, while some poor passengers survived because they ignored the rules and fought their way to safety. Take Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, who reportedly changed into his finest evening wear and announced that he was prepared to go down like a gentleman. This is either the most dignified response to impending doom in human history, or evidence that rich people had so little experience with actual problems that they didn't know how to panic properly. Guggenheim died, but his valet survived, which suggests that sometimes being paid to follow rich people around actually has its advantages. Then there's the story of Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, who was nouveau. Rich and therefore not quite accepted by the established wealthy passengers. When the ship started sinking, Brown took charge of her lifeboat like a Colorado mining camp boss, threatening to throw anyone overboard who didn't help row. Her working-class background actually saved lives, while the refined manners of other first-class passengers led to lifeboats launching half-empty, because nobody wanted to appear pushy. The crew's behavior was equally contradictory. Some officers died trying to save passengers, while others spent their final moments ensuring that the proper social order was maintained, even as the ship disappeared beneath the waves. Fifth Officer Harold Blow actually went back to search for survivors in the water, which was either heroically brave or professionally suicidal, depending on your perspective, even more absurd. Some third-class passengers initially refused to board lifeboats because they didn't believe the ship was actually sinking. The Titanic was marketed as unsinkable, and these passengers had taken the marketing materials seriously. They figured the lifeboats were just a precaution, like fire drills in a building made of asbestos. This touching faith in advertising claims probably killed more people than the actual iceberg. The result was a disaster that perfectly illustrated the brutal mathematics of social inequality. The wealthy passengers didn't just buy better accommodations. They bought better chances of survival. The class system that seemed so natural and proper in the dining rooms became a death sentence in the lifeboats. The immediate aftermath revealed the ugly truth about Edwardian society. Newspapers initially focused on the heroic deaths of wealthy men, while barely mentioning the hundreds of poor passengers who drowned in steerage. John Jacob Astor's death made front-page headlines, while the 11 members of the Sage family were listed in small print, if at all. The media treated the disaster like a tragic opera where the wealthy passengers were the star performers and everyone else was just background chorus. Insurance companies immediately began calculating payouts based on social class. First class passengers' families received substantial settlements, while third-class families often received nothing more than condolences and bills for the transportation their loved ones hadn't lived to complete. The legal system treated the deaths of wealthy passengers as tragic losses, while viewing the deaths of poor passengers as unfortunate but expected casualties of ocean travel. The British and American investigations that followed focused heavily on the heroic behavior of wealthy passengers, while glossing over the systemic barriers that had prevented poor passengers from reaching safety. Officials praised the women and children first policy while ignoring the fact that it had been selectively enforced based on ticket price. The shipping industry's response was to implement new safety regulations that would prevent future disasters by requiring enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, regardless of class. This revolutionary concept of treating all human lives as equally valuable was apparently so radical that it required an international maritime disaster to make it seem reasonable. Meanwhile, as the class system was revealing its deadly consequences, another factor was quietly determining who would live and who would die: the ship's design itself. The very features that made the Titanic a marvel of engineering would become death traps when the ship began its final plunge. The watertight compartments that were supposed to make the ship unsinkable actually created a maze of barriers that trapped passengers below decks. The grand staircase that impressed first-class passengers became a waterfall that flooded the lower levels. Even the ship's size, which was supposed to provide stability and safety, worked against the passengers. It took nearly 3 hours for the Titanic to sink, which sounds like plenty of time to evacuate everyone, but was actually just long enough for panic to set in, confusion to reign, and the systematic barriers between classes to do their deadly work. The ship's designers had created a floating palace, but they had forgotten that palaces burn down, and when they do, the servants usually die first. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a three-dimensional representation of social hierarchy. And when it started sinking, gravity didn't care about your social status, but the ship's design and the crew's priorities certainly did. The next phase of our story reveals how the very engineering marvels that were supposed to save lives became the instruments of their destruction. If the class system was the Titanic's social death trap, then the ship's design was its engineering death trap. And the beautiful irony is that the very features marketed as safety innovations were actually elaborate methods of killing people more efficiently. The Titanic wasn't just big. It was catastrophically, monumentally, apocalyptically big in all the wrong ways. While the class system determined who got priority access to lifeboats, the ship's design determined whether you could actually reach those lifeboats before becoming an involuntary deep-sea explorer. The engineers who designed the Titanic suffered from what we might call Victorian confidence syndrome, the unshakable belief that if you made something big enough and complicated enough, it would automatically be better. This was the same era that gave us the Hindenburg, so we're not exactly dealing with a track record of flawless engineering judgment. The ship's designers created what they believed was a floating fortress, but what they actually built was a floating maze designed to trap passengers in the most inconvenient locations possible when disaster struck. The Titanic's engineering marvels included watertight compartments that weren't actually watertight, a revolutionary propulsion system that couldn't be stopped quickly enough to avoid icebergs, and a hull design that was supposedly indestructible but turned out to be about as durable as a tin can in a blender. The ship was 882 feet long, which sounds impressive until you realize that this length created a structural nightmare when the front started sinking faster than the back. Every single feature that made the Titanic famous became a liability when the ship started its unscheduled descent to the ocean floor. The grand staircase became a waterfall. The watertight compartments became individual death chambers. And the ship's revolutionary size became a physics lesson in how really big things can sink really slowly while killing people really efficiently. Consider the ship's most famous feature, the grand staircase that everyone remembers from the movie. This wasn't just a pretty decoration. It was a 60-foot-tall architectural monument to wealthy passenger convenience. The staircase connected multiple decks with sweeping curves and ornate details that impressed first-class passengers and probably made the ship's carpenters question their life choices. But when the ship started flooding, this grand staircase became a high-speed water slide straight to the bottom of the ship. Water poured down those elegant curves like a decorative waterfall, flooding the lower decks where third-class passengers were trying to escape. The same feature that allowed wealthy passengers to make dramatic entrances at dinner parties became a death funnel for anyone unfortunate enough to be below it when the ship started sinking. The staircase's design also created a massive structural weakness. Those beautiful open spaces that impress passengers became vertical highways for water, allowing the ocean to flood multiple decks simultaneously. It was like building a ship with a built-in drainage system, except the drainage was working in reverse and the water was coming from outside. Then there were the watertight compartments, which were marketed as the ship's ultimate safety feature. The Titanic could supposedly survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, which sounds impressive until you learn that the iceberg damage affected 6 compartments. But here's the real kicker. The watertight compartments weren't actually watertight at the top. They were like ice cube trays without lids. So when the ship started tilting, water simply sloshed from one compartment to the next like liquid playing hopscotch. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, realized this fatal flaw almost immediately. After the collision, he reportedly did some quick calculations and announced that the ship had about an hour to live, which was impressively accurate for mental math performed during a crisis. Andrews spent his final hours trying to help passengers escape his own deadly creation, which is either admirably responsible or a case study in professional guilt. The ship's electrical system provides another perfect example of how advanced technology became a death trap. The Titanic had the most sophisticated electrical system of any ship ever built, with electric lighting throughout and even electric elevators for first-class passengers. But when the ship's power generators flooded, the entire lower deck was plunged into darkness. Just when passengers needed light most desperately to navigate the maze of corridors and stairways, the elevators became vertical coffins. Passengers who tried to use them found themselves trapped between floors when the power failed, and the elevator shafts became perfect channels for water to flood the ship even faster. The crew members operating these elevators stayed at their posts, trying to help passengers escape, which was either heroically dedicated or a case study in following job descriptions too, literally during apocalyptic events. Even the ship's revolutionary propulsion system worked against survival. The Titanic had 3 massive propellers designed for maximum efficiency, but they couldn't be reversed quickly enough to avoid the iceberg. First Officer William Murdoch ordered hard a starboard and full astern, but the ship's momentum and the time required to reverse those massive engines meant that the Titanic was essentially trying to stop a runaway freight train with a handbrake. The ship's size, which was supposed to provide stability, actually made everything worse. At 882 feet long, the The Titanic was longer than the Chrysler Building is tall, which created a leverage problem when the front started sinking. The ship didn't just sink. It broke in half because the structural stress of being that long while tilting at an angle exceeded the hull's ability to hold together. Passengers watched in horror as their supposedly indestructible ship literally snapped like a pencil, creating two separate disasters instead of one. This wasn't isolated incompetence. It was systematic overconfidence. The same pattern appeared in every aspect of the ship's design. Engineers created solutions that worked perfectly under normal conditions, but became death traps during emergencies. The Titanic represented the pinnacle of an era that believed technology could overcome any natural obstacle, including basic physics and common sense. The watertight compartment system was copied from naval architecture, where it made sense because warships were designed to take damage and keep fighting. But passenger ships weren't supposed to hit icebergs. They were supposed to avoid them. The designers took a military solution and applied it to a civilian problem, like wearing a bulletproof vest to prevent sunburn. This pattern of misapplied technology appeared throughout the ship. The Titanic's builders used the finest materials and most advanced techniques available, but they applied them to a design philosophy that prioritized impressiveness over practicality. The ship was built to impress passengers and newspaper reporters, not to function efficiently during emergencies. The same overconfidence appeared in ships built before and after the Titanic. The Lusitania, launched in 1907, was built for speed over safety and was torpedoed by a German submarine in 1915. The Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship, was supposedly improved based on lessons learned from the disaster, but it sank in 1916 after hitting a mine. The pattern was clear. Shipbuilders were solving the wrong problems with the wrong solutions. Social and political factors reinforced this pattern. The shipping industry was locked in a competition for the largest, fastest, most luxurious ships, which meant that safety considerations were secondary to marketing considerations. Regulations were written by the same people who owned the shipping companies, which is like asking foxes to design henhouse security systems. Economic pressures made the pattern even worse. Building truly safe ships would have been expensive and would have reduced passenger capacity, which would have hurt profits. The industry operated on the assumption that disasters were rare enough that they could be treated as acceptable losses, rather than preventable tragedies. This was capitalism at its most cynical, prioritizing shareholder profits over passenger safety while marketing the result as technological progress. The effects were catastrophic and permanent. The engineering failures didn't just kill people, they destroyed public faith in technological progress and forced a complete redesign of maritime safety standards. The Titanic disaster proved that bigger wasn't automatically better, and that impressive engineering could be impressively dangerous. The wealthy passengers who had paid premium prices for the privilege of sailing on the most advanced ship ever built discovered that their money had bought them tickets aboard a floating death trap. The Astors, Whittiners, and Guggenheims hadn't just purchased luxury accommodations. They had purchased front-row seats to a demonstration of how engineering hubris could kill people efficiently and expensively. The working-class passengers suffered. Even more, the ship's design trapped them in the lower decks, where the engineering failures were most deadly. The same watertight compartments that were supposed to save the ship became individual prisons for passengers who couldn't escape before. The water rose. The grand staircase that they never got to use became the mechanism that flooded their quarters. The crew members who operated the ship's systems became unwitting participants in a mass killing. The engineers who stayed at their posts to keep the power running died trying to fix a problem that couldn't be fixed. The elevator operators who tried to help passengers escape died when their advanced technology became a death trap. These weren't heroes choosing to sacrifice themselves. They were victims of a design that turned their jobs into suicide missions. The unintended consequences rippled through the entire maritime industry. Ship designers were forced to abandon the bigger is better philosophy that had driven naval architecture for decades. The concept of watertight compartments was completely redesigned, and ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, regardless of class or the phase or the end. Supposed unsinkability of the vessel. The disaster also revealed the fundamental problem with treating safety as a luxury feature. The Titanic's designers had created elaborate safety systems for first-class passengers while treating third-class passengers as expendable cargo. The ship's design reflected the same social hierarchy that determined lifeboat access. Wealthy passengers got the best safety features, while poor passengers got whatever was left over. Modern parallels are everywhere. The Titanic disaster was essentially a preview of every technological disaster that would follow. The Hindenburg, Chernobyl, Challenger, and countless others, where impressive engineering failed catastrophically because the people designing the teeth and finding the designing the Marzanan were catastrophically because the people designing the town people designing the systems were solving the wrong problems with the wrong priorities. Yet even as the ship's design was revealing its fatal flaws, another factor was simultaneously determining who would live and who would die: the crew's response to the emergency. The same officers who had been trained to operate the ship's advanced systems were now faced with the impossible task of evacuating passengers from a vessel that was designed more for luxury than for emergency evacuation. The crew's training had prepared them for routine operations aboard an unsinkable ship, not for managing a mass evacuation from a sinking death trap. Their protocols were designed for a world where the Titanic's advanced safety features would prevent disasters, not for a reality where those same safety features had become the primary obstacles to survival. As the ship's engineering marvels transformed into engineering disasters, the human element became even more critical. The crew members who understood the ship's systems best were also the ones who realized most quickly that those systems were failing catastrophically. They faced an impossible choice: follow their training and try to save the ship, or abandon their posts and try to save the passengers. The collision with the iceberg had lasted only 37 seconds, but the consequences of that brief encounter would reveal every flaw in the ship's design, the crew's training, and the entire philosophy of maritime safety. The peak drama was about to begin, and it would test every system, every person, and every assumption about how civilized people behave when civilization itself is sinking beneath their feet. By 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the Titanic had reached the perfect storm of human overconfidence, engineering arrogance, and what we might generously call aggressive optimism about iceberg avoidance. The ship was steaming at nearly full speed through an ice field that had been described in multiple warnings as extensive, heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, which in maritime terms translates to maybe slow down, you absolute maniacs. The key players in this unfolding disaster included Captain Smith, who was treating his final voyage like a retirement party; First Officer William Murdoch, who was about to have the worst 37 seconds of his very brief remaining life; and Frederick Fleet, the lookout, who spotted the iceberg and probably wished he had called in sick that day. The stakes couldn't have been higher, not just because 1,500 people were about to die, but because the entire myth of technological invincibility was about to be demolished by a chunk of frozen water that couldn't even be bothered to get out of the way. The crisis had been building all day. The ship had received 6 separate ice warnings, which Captain Smith had acknowledged with the maritime equivalent of thanks for the heads up. But we'll be fine. The final warning never even reached the bridge because the radio operator was too busy sending passenger telegrams about trivial social engagements. Imagine dying because someone prioritized having wonderful time. Wish you were here messages over. There are icebergs everywhere. Please don't sail into them warnings. The temperature had dropped dramatically, creating perfect conditions for ice formation and terrible conditions for survival. The sea was unusually calm, which sounds pleasant until you realize that calm water makes icebergs virtually invisible because there are no waves breaking against them. Nature had essentially created a perfect ambush scenario, and the Titanic was sailing directly into it at 22 knots while the crew focused on maintaining their dinner schedule. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet spotted something that shouldn't have been there, a massive iceberg directly ahead. Fleet immediately struck the crow's nest bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge with the immortal words, "Iceberg right ahead," which is possibly the most understated emergency announcement in maritime history. It's like calling the fire department to report minor warmth situation in progress. First Officer Murdoch heard the warning and immediately ordered hard a starboard and full astern, which were the correct responses if you enjoy watching physics demonstrations about momentum and the impossibility of stopping 46,000 tons of moving ship in 37 seconds. Murdoch also ordered the watertight doors closed, which was either a brilliant safety measure or the maritime equivalent of closing the barn door after the horses have escaped, galloped to the next county, and started their own farm. The collision itself lasted exactly 37 seconds, which is barely enough time to realize you're about to die, let alone do anything productive about it. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship, like the world's most expensive and deadly can opener, creating a series of small punctures that were individually minor but collectively catastrophic. It wasn't the dramatic head-on collision that movies would later depict. It was more like being killed by 1,000 paper cuts. Except the paper cuts were made by frozen water, and the 1,000 was actually 6. The sound of the collision was described by passengers as everything from a slight jar to like an earthquake, which suggests that either people experienced trauma differently, or some passengers were significantly more intoxicated than others. Margaret Brown later said it felt like the ship had run aground, while other passengers reported hearing a grinding noise that lasted for several seconds. The third-class passengers, who were closest to the impact, heard the unmistakable sound of their futures being cancelled. Captain Smith, who had been sleeping, arrived on the bridge and asked Murdoch what had happened. Murdoch reportedly replied, "An iceberg, sir. I hard a-starboarded and reversed the engines, and I was going to hard a-port around it, but she was too close." This is possibly the most polite way anyone has ever announced that they had just killed 1,500 people through a combination of overconfidence and insufficient deceleration. Smith immediately ordered the ship's carpenter to inspect the damage, which was like asking someone to estimate how much water a sieve can hold. The carpenter reported back with the kind of technical assessment that only someone who has seen their professional expertise become irrelevant can deliver. The ship was flooding fast. The damage was below the waterline in multiple compartments, and they were all going to die. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was summoned to assess the situation. Andrews took one look at the damage and performed some quick mental calculations that would have impressed mathematics professors and terrified anyone who understood their implications. He informed Captain Smith that the ship would sink in approximately 1 hour, maybe 2 if they were lucky. This was not the kind of professional consultation that Smith had been hoping for. The initial response was a masterclass in bureaucratic confusion. Some crew members began waking passengers and directing them to put on life jackets, while others continued serving drinks in the first-class smoking lounge, because apparently the show must go on even when the theater is sinking. The ship's band began playing cheerful music to keep passengers calm, which was either thoughtfully reassuring or the most inappropriate soundtrack selection in maritime history. Meanwhile, in the engine rooms, the crew was discovering that all those advanced safety features were working exactly as designed, which is to say, they were efficiently channeling water throughout the ship like a maritime distribution system. The watertight compartments were filling in sequence, the electrical systems were failing systematically, and the ship's impressive size was ensuring that the disaster would unfold slowly enough for everyone to fully appreciate their impending doom. The radio operators began sending distress signals, starting with the traditional CQD before switching to the newer SOS signal. This was actually one of the first times SOS was used in a real emergency, which means the Titanic managed to be historically significant even while sinking. The nearest ship, the Californian, had turned off its radio for the night, which was either incredibly bad timing or a preview of how customer service would work in the future. The response was a perfect demonstration of how people behave when their fundamental assumptions about reality are suddenly proven catastrophically wrong. First-class passengers initially treated the situation like an amusing inconvenience, with some reportedly joking about the iceberg and requesting pieces of ice for their drinks. This is either admirably British stoicism or evidence that extreme wealth makes people incapable of recognizing genuine danger. The crew's reaction was a mixture of professional competence and bureaucratic paralysis. Some officers immediately began organizing lifeboat deployment, while others continued following normal shipboard procedures as if nothing had happened. The ship's hierarchy, which had worked perfectly during normal operations, became a liability during the emergency. Orders had to flow up and down the chain of command, even when time was measured in minutes rather than hours. Third-class passengers faced the additional challenge of not being informed about the severity of the situation. Many were told to put on life jackets and wait for further instructions, which was like telling people to wear seatbelts while you figured out whether the airplane was actually crashing. Some third-class passengers returned to their cabins to retrieve valuables, not understanding that they were voluntarily returning to what would soon become underwater tombs. The immediate consequences were both predictable and chaotic. The ship's electrical systems began failing, plunging the lower decks into darkness just when passengers needed light most desperately. The flooding caused the ship to develop a list to starboard, which made walking difficult and launching lifeboats nearly impossible on one side of the ship. The ship's impressive length, which had been a selling point for passenger comfort, became a structural liability as different sections of the ship experienced different rates of flooding. Perhaps most tragically, the initial response revealed how unprepared everyone was for an actual emergency. The crew had been trained to operate an unsinkable ship, not to evacuate a sinking one. Passengers had been sold tickets aboard a floating palace, not a disaster waiting to happen. The entire system, from the ship's design to the crew's training, to the passengers' expectations, was built around the assumption that the Titanic would never sink. The political and social fallout began immediately, even before the ship had finished sinking. The wireless messages being sent from the Titanic weren't just distress calls. They were real-time documentation of the failure of everything that Edwardian society believed about progress, technology, and civilization. This collision wasn't just a ship hitting an iceberg. It was the moment when the 20th century's relationship with technology permanently changed. The Titanic represented the pinnacle of human engineering confidence, and its destruction proved that nature didn't care how impressive your technology was. If your planning was fundamentally flawed, the disaster revealed the brutal mathematics of emergency preparedness. The ship's designers had calculated that the Titanic could survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, but they had never considered what would happen if something damaged more than 4 compartments. This wasn't a failure of engineering. It was a failure of imagination. The designers had solved the problems they could envision while ignoring the problems they couldn't imagine. The collision also demonstrated how quickly social hierarchies could become deadly during emergencies. The same class system that had seemed natural and proper during dinner service became a systematic method of determining who would live and who would die when the lifeboats were launched. The disaster wasn't just about bad luck or poor seamanship. It was about how societies prioritize human lives when resources become scarce. Most significantly, the Titanic disaster marked the end of the era when people believed that technology could overcome any natural obstacle. The ship had been marketed as practically unsinkable, and the public had interpreted practically as definitely. The collision taught an entire generation that there's no such thing as foolproof technology, only technology that hasn't encountered the right fool yet. The broader implications would reshape maritime law, ship design, and public attitudes toward technological progress. But in the immediate aftermath, as the ship began its final descent, those implications were secondary to the more pressing question of who would survive the next few hours and who would become permanent residents of the North Atlantic Ocean floor. Around the main disaster of people dying because they trusted marketing materials about unsinkable ships, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in transforming a simple iceberg collision into a masterclass in human nature under pressure. These weren't just statistics. They were individuals who each found their own unique way to face the end of the world. And their stories reveal everything you need to know about how people behave when their assumptions about reality are suddenly proven catastrophically wrong. Wallace Hartley was the band leader who made the decision that would make him immortal. He kept his band playing music while the ship sank. This wasn't just professional dedication. It was either the most heroic act of customer service in history or evidence that musicians will literally play until they die rather than disappoint an audience. Hartley and his 8-piece band continued performing for over 2 hours as the ship gradually transformed from a luxury liner into a vertical diving platform. They started with cheerful ragtime tunes to keep passengers calm and allegedly ended with the hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," which was either deeply spiritual or the most grimly appropriate song selection ever. All 9 band members died, which means they were either incredibly brave or incredibly committed to their union contracts. Benjamin Guggenheim represented the pinnacle of wealthy passenger denial. When informed that the ship was sinking, Guggenheim and his valet reportedly changed into full evening dress because they were prepared to go down like gentlemen. This is either the most dignified response to impending doom in human history, or proof that extreme wealth makes people respond to emergencies like they're attending a formal dinner party. Guggenheim allegedly told a steward, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen. But I would like you to tell my wife that I played the game out straight to the end. No woman shall be left aboard this ship because..." Van Guggenheim was a coward. He then sat in the first-class smoking lounge, ordered a brandy, and waited to die with the kind of composure that suggests either remarkable courage or complete disconnection from reality. Ida Strauss, wife of Macy's department store owner Isidore Strauss, refused to leave her husband's side when offered a place in a lifeboat. She reportedly said, "Where you go, I go. We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." This was either the most romantic declaration of love in maritime history, or evidence that some people prefer to die together rather than live apart, which is either beautiful or a concerning approach to relationship management. The Strausses were last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands as the ship tilted toward its final dive. Their story became legendary, though it's worth noting that their devotion to each other didn't extend to offering their lifeboat seats to any of the third-class families who were being systematically excluded from rescue. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man aboard the ship, spent his final hours helping his pregnant wife into a lifeboat and then politely asking if he could join her. When told that only women and children were allowed, Astor reportedly responded with something like, "Well, I suppose that's the rule," lit a cigarette, and began what was probably the most expensive wait for death in human history. His body was later recovered with $2,500 in cash, a gold watch, and cufflinks, which suggests that either he dressed for the occasion or wealthy people in 1912 carried enough money to buy a small house as casual pocket change. Margaret Molly. Brown became the hero of Lifeboat No. 6 by taking command when the designated officer proved to be less competent than a department store manager during Black Friday. Brown, who had grown up in poverty before marrying into mining wealth, threatened to throw anyone overboard who didn't help row, which was either admirably practical leadership or proof that working class backgrounds provide better emergency management training than finishing schools. She later became known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, though this nickname wasn't used during her lifetime and was probably invented by people who appreciated alliteration more than historical accuracy. These weren't isolated incidents of people behaving strangely during a disaster. They were interconnected stories that revealed how social networks, personal relationships, and pure coincidence could determine who lived and who died. The web of relationships aboard the Titanic was like a social experiment designed to test whether civilization could survive, when the underlying assumptions about safety and survival were suddenly proven wrong. The ship's postal workers, John Star March, Oscar Woody, and William Logan Gwynn, spent their final hours trying to save the mail, which was either admirably dedicated public service or evidence that government employees will follow their job descriptions, even during apocalyptic events. They moved 200 sacks of mail from the flooding mailroom to higher decks, not because the mail was particularly important, but because that's what postal workers do. All three died, which means they literally died trying to ensure that people's letters would be delivered, making them either heroes or a perfect example of how bureaucratic thinking can be fatal during emergencies. The connections between passengers created bizarre chains of survival and death. The Widner family was traveling with their friends the Carters, and both families had booked first-class accommodations that should have guaranteed their survival. Mrs. Widner and Mrs. Carter both survived, but their husbands died, which created a bond between the two women that lasted for decades. They had shared the experience of watching their privileged world literally sink beneath their feet while being saved by the same class system that condemned others to death. Meanwhile, the ship's crew members faced impossible choices between following orders and saving lives. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, spent his final hours moving through the ship, trying to help passengers escape his own creation. He was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting called Plymouth Harbor, having apparently given up on survival and chosen to go down with his masterpiece of engineering overconfidence. Andrews knew better than anyone how the ship's safety features had become death traps, and he spent his remaining time trying to guide people around the obstacles he had inadvertently created. The ship's officers created their own network of tragedy and heroism. Sixth Officer James Moody helped load lifeboats until the very end and was last seen trying to free collapsible Boat A from the ship's deck as the water rose around him. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe was the only officer to return to search for survivors in the water, which was either heroically brave or professionally obligated, depending on how you interpret maritime law. Chief Purser Hugh McElroy continued collecting passenger valuables and maintaining financial records until the ship's safe was underwater, which was either admirably thorough record-keeping or evidence that some people will continue doing paperwork. During the apocalypse, the most tragic interconnected story involved a families traveling together. The Sage family 11 people total, had sold everything they owned for the chance at a new life in America. They were traveling in third class, which meant they faced locked gates, no crew assistance, and a labyrinthine route to the lifeboats that would have challenged a trained athlete, let alone a family with 9 children. Not one member of the Sage family survived, but their story became connected to other third-class families who faced the same systematic barriers to survival. Political networks also determined survival. The Astors and Whittiers weren't just wealthy. They were connected to shipping industry leaders who had influenced the very regulations that determined lifeboat capacity. Their deaths became front-page news, not just because they were rich, but because they were the kind of people who normally influenced policy rather than becoming victims of it. Their deaths forced a reckoning with the regulatory system that had prioritized passenger comfort over passenger safety, though this reckoning would come too late to save anyone aboard the Titanic. To understand how these characters behaved during the disaster, you have to understand the cultural context of 1912, which was a time when people believed that civilization, technology, and proper etiquette could overcome any natural obstacle, including basic physics and common sense. This was the Edwardian era, when the British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's population, and people genuinely believed that being British, wealthy, or properly dressed provided some kind of supernatural protection against inconvenient realities like drowning. Daily life in 1912 was governed by elaborate social rules that determined everything from how you dressed to whom you could speak to whether you deserved to survive. Maritime disasters. First-class passengers didn't just pay more for better accommodations. They paid for the privilege of being treated as if their lives were inherently more valuable than other people's lives. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual. It was considered the natural order of things, like gravity or the inevitability of death from preventable diseases. The belief system of 1912 included the revolutionary concept that technology could solve any problem, which explains why people were willing to board a ship that was marketed as unsinkable, despite being operated by humans who were demonstrably sinkable. This was the same era that produced the phrase, "God himself could not sink this ship," which was either impressive confidence or a direct challenge to the universe to prove otherwise. Social structures in 1912 were designed to maintain order during normal times, that they became actively deadly during emergencies. The idea that women and children should be saved first wasn't based on practical considerations about survival. It was based on Victorian notions of chivalry that assumed men were naturally more expendable than women, unless those men were extremely wealthy, in which case the rules became more flexible. What was considered normal behavior included maintaining proper appearance even during disasters, following authority figures even when those authority figures were clearly incompetent, and prioritizing social etiquette over practical survival considerations. Passengers who survived the disaster often mentioned being impressed by how calm and orderly people remained as the ship sank, which was either admirable British restraint or evidence that social conditioning could override basic survival instincts. The Edwardian approach to disaster management was essentially to maintain normal social hierarchies, while hoping that someone in authority would fix the problem. This worked fine during minor inconveniences like labor strikes or political scandals, but proved spectacularly inadequate when the problem was that the floor was becoming the ceiling and the ceiling was becoming an underwater tourist attraction. Perhaps most absurd was how the disaster revealed the fundamental contradictions of Edwardian society, where the same people who believed in technological progress also believed that social hierarchies were more important than basic survival. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a floating microcosm of a society that had convinced itself that wealth and proper breeding could overcome natural laws. The ultimate irony was that many wealthy passengers died because they were too polite to save themselves, Benjamin Guggenheim and Isidor Straus could have fought their way onto lifeboats, but their social conditioning prevented them from appearing ungentlemanly, even when appearing ungentlemanly might have saved their lives. Meanwhile, some poor passengers survived because they ignored social rules and fought for survival, which suggests that desperation might be better training for emergencies than finishing school. The ship's crew faced their own contradictions. They've been trained to provide excellent customer service aboard an unsinkable ship. But when the ship started sinking, their customer service training became a liability. Stewards continued trying to make passengers comfortable, even when comfort was no longer possible, and officers continued following protocols, even when those protocols were designed for situations that no longer existed. Even more ridiculous, some passengers initially refused to board lifeboats because they didn't want to leave the warm, well-lit ship for a small boat on the cold, dark ocean. The Titanic's luxury accommodations were so impressive that people literally chose to stay aboard a sinking ship rather than accept a downgrade in comfort level. This was either touching faith in the ship's indestructibility or evidence that some people would rather die in first class than live in economy. The disaster also revealed how modern these supposedly civilized people actually were. When the lifeboats were launched, some contained fewer than half their capacity because nobody wanted to appear greedy by filling them completely. Meanwhile, other lifeboats were launched with passengers actively preventing additional people from boarding, which suggests that civilization is a much thinner veneer than most people realize. And it becomes even thinner when the alternative is drowning in the North Atlantic. Everything changed when Captain Smith gave the order to uncover the lifeboats at 12:05 a.m., 25 minutes after the collision, which was either impressively quick decision-making or evidence that it had taken him almost half an hour to accept that his unsinkable ship was enthusiastically sinking. This single command transformed the Titanic from a luxury cruise into a floating demonstration of how quickly civilization can collapse when the underlying assumptions about safety and survival are suddenly proven catastrophically wrong. The background to this change was a series of increasingly desperate consultations between Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and the ship's officers, who had spent the previous 25 minutes hoping that the laws of physics might make an exception for really expensive boats. Andrews had performed his calculations and delivered his professional assessment that the ship would sink in approximately 1 to 2 hours, which was the kind of technical consultation that nobody wanted to receive, but everyone needed to hear. This moment was different because it marked the transition from denial to acceptance, from treating the situation as a minor inconvenience to acknowledging it as a major catastrophe. Up until this point, many passengers and crew members had been operating under the assumption that the Titanic's advanced safety features would somehow prevent the disaster from becoming an actual disaster. The order to uncover the lifeboats was essentially Captain Smith's official announcement that technology had failed, marketing materials had lied, and everyone aboard was now participating in an unscheduled survival exercise. Key factors that led to this transformation included the increasingly obvious list of the ship to starboard, the rising water levels in the forward compartments, and the growing realization among the crew that their training for operating an unsinkable ship had not adequately prepared them for evacuating a sinking one. The ship's electrical systems were beginning to fail, which meant that the lower decks were being plunged into darkness just when passengers needed light, most desperately to navigate the maze of corridors and stairways that led to the boat deck. Temperature was also dropping rapidly, both inside and outside the ship, which created an additional urgency to the evacuation process. The North Atlantic in April was cold enough to kill people within minutes of immersion, which meant that the lifeboats weren't just transportation. They were the difference between an uncomfortable boat ride and becoming a permanent resident of the ocean floor. The crew's growing awareness of these factors transformed their approach from maintaining passenger comfort during a minor emergency to getting people off this ship before it becomes a submarine. The process of change unfolded like a slow-motion disaster movie directed by someone who had never seen a disaster movie and was making up the plot as they went along. The crew began the evacuation process with the kind of methodical approach that worked perfectly for routine operations, but was spectacularly inappropriate for emergency situations where time was measured in minutes rather than hours. Resistance to change came from multiple sources, each more frustrating than the last. Many passengers initially refused to board the lifeboats because they didn't want to leave the warm, well-lit ship for a small boat on the cold, dark ocean. This was either touching faith in the ship's marketing materials or evidence that people will choose comfort over survival, even when survival becomes questionable. Some first-class passengers complained that the lifeboats were too small, too crowded, or too far below their usual standards of accommodation, which was like complaining about the thread count of life preservers. The crew themselves showed resistance to abandoning normal procedures. Stewards continued trying to maintain passenger service, even as the ship tilted increasingly toward its unscheduled dive to the ocean floor. Some officers insisted on following the exact protocols for lifeboat deployment, which had been designed for calm seas and unlimited time, not for a sinking ship and freezing weather with a limited number of evacuation vessels. Champions of change included officers like Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, who realized that following normal procedures would kill everyone and began taking initiative to speed up the evacuation process. Chief Officer Henry Wild worked to organize the port-side lifeboat deployment while dealing with increasingly panicked passengers and crew members who were discovering that their training had not prepared them for this specific combination of mechanical failure and impending doom. The specific steps of the evacuation process revealed every flaw in the ship's design and the crew's preparation. First, the crew had to remove the lifeboat covers, which sounds simple until you realize that the covers were secured with multiple ropes and required several crew members working together. Then they had to swing the lifeboats out over the side of the ship, which required operating mechanical davits that most crew members had never used under emergency conditions. Loading the lifeboats created additional obstacles that would have been comedic if they weren't so deadly. The ship's list to starboard meant that the starboard lifeboats hung away from the ship's side, creating a gap that passengers had to jump across. The portside lifeboats pressed against the ship's hull, which made loading difficult and launching nearly impossible. The crew had to time the loading process with the ship's movement, which was like trying to board a bus that was simultaneously tilting and sinking. Breakthrough moments came when individual crew members abandoned official procedures and began improvising solutions. Sixth Officer James Moody began loading lifeboats beyond their official capacity, reasoning that slightly overcrowded lifeboats were better than properly loaded lifeboats that left people to die. Second Officer Charles Lidler began allowing men to board lifeboats if there were no women or children present, which was either practical flexibility or evidence that even maritime chivalry had its limits. The role of individuals versus larger forces became increasingly clear as the evacuation progressed. Individual crew members could speed up or slow down the loading process, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental problem that there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Personal initiative could save some lives, but it couldn't solve the systematic failure of maritime safety regulations that had prioritized passenger comfort over passenger survival. The most significant breakthrough came when passengers began taking control of their own evacuation rather than waiting for crew members to organize them. Margaret Brown's takeover of Lifeboat No. 6 became a model for passenger self-organization, while other lifeboats floundered under the command of crew members who were following procedures designed for situations that no longer existed. The physical process of change was accompanied by a psychological transformation as passengers and crew members gradually accepted that their assumptions about safety, technology, and civilization had been proven wrong by a chunk of floating ice that couldn't be bothered to get out of the way of progress. The new reality aboard the Titanic was that survival had replaced comfort as the primary concern, and the social hierarchies that had seemed natural and proper during dinner service became life and death decisions during lifeboat loading. This wasn't just a change in priorities. It was a complete transformation of how the ship functioned as a social system. The new rules were supposedly based on women and children first, but the actual implementation revealed how class distinctions could override even the most basic humanitarian principles. First-class women and children went first. Second-class women and children went second. And third-class women and children went whenever there was space left over, which was often never. The crew members responsible for enforcing these priorities weren't being malicious. They were following the same social programming that had governed every other aspect of ship operations. What stayed the same was the fundamental belief that some lives were more valuable than others, but this belief was now being implemented through lifeboat access rather than dinner reservations. The crew members who had been trained to provide differential service based on ticket price continued providing differential service based on ticket price, except now the service was survival assistance rather than champagne delivery. What changed dramatically was the speed at which decisions had to be made. The careful deliberation that characterized normal ship operations was replaced by split-second choices about who would live and who would die. Crew members who had been trained to consult superiors before making important decisions now had to decide independently whether to fill lifeboats to capacity or launch them half-empty to maintain social distinctions. The new system created winners and losers in ways that had nothing to do with personal merit or moral character. Wealthy passengers who had never faced genuine hardship in their lives discovered that their money could buy them priority access to lifeboats, while poor passengers who had survived genuine hardships discovered that their survival skills were useless when the obstacles to survival were locked gates and systematic exclusion rather than poverty or disease. Crew members faced their own transformation from service providers to survival coordinators. Stewards who had been trained to anticipate passenger needs now had to make life and death decisions about passenger priorities. Officers who had been trained to maintain order now had to choose between following procedures and saving lives. The ship's physical transformation accompanied the social transformation. The elegant dining rooms became staging areas for evacuation. The grand staircase became a waterfall, and the promenade decks became launching platforms for lifeboats. The luxury accommodations that had impressed passengers during boarding became obstacles to escape during evacuation. Perhaps most significantly, the new reality revealed how quickly the veneer of civilization could disappear when survival became uncertain. Passengers who had been models of proper behavior during dinner service became desperate competitors for lifeboat space. Crew members who had been paragons of professional service became individuals, trying to balance their duty to passengers with their own desire to survive. The transformation was so complete that survivors would later describe the sinking Titanic as a completely different ship from the one they had boarded in Southampton. The luxury liner had become a floating disaster, and the passengers had become refugees from their own assumptions about safety, technology, and the reliability of marketing materials. Was this change positive or negative? From one perspective, the transformation of the Titanic from luxury liner to evacuation platform represented humanity at its best, people helping each other during a crisis, crew members sacrificing their lives for passengers, and individuals rising above their social programming to save lives. The stories of officers who stayed at their posts, band members who continued playing, and passengers who helped others into lifeboats suggest that crisis can bring out the heroic aspects of human nature. From another perspective, the change revealed humanity at its worst. The systematic exclusion of poor passengers from lifeboats, the prioritization of social status over human life, and the implementation of survival policies that treated some people as expendable. The fact that first-class men had better survival rates than third-class children suggests that the crisis simply made existing social inequalities more deadly rather than inspiring people to transcend them. The short-term effects were catastrophic for everyone involved, but the long-term effects varied dramatically based on social class. Wealthy survivors received substantial insurance settlements and sympathy from the press, while poor survivors often received nothing more than bills for transportation costs and condolences for their losses. The unintended consequences of the change included a complete transformation of maritime safety regulations. But this transformation came too late to save anyone aboard the Titanic. The disaster also created a new genre of disaster literature and eventually disaster movies, which suggests that people found the story of technological failure and social inequality sufficiently entertaining to turn it into popular culture. Modern judgment tends to focus on the heroic individual stories while downplaying the systematic failures that made those heroic gestures necessary. Contemporary views were more focused on the failure of technology and the breakdown of social order, which suggests that people in 1912 understood the disaster differently than people do today. In the hours that followed the initial evacuation, the Titanic transformed from a luxury liner with a minor ice problem into a vertical demonstration of why physics doesn't care about your engineering confidence or marketing budget. The ship's behavior became increasingly dramatic as more compartments flooded, creating a slow-motion disaster that gave everyone plenty of time to fully appreciate their impending doom while being unable to do anything productive about it. New challenges emerged as the ship's list became more pronounced, and the deck began tilting at angles that made walking difficult and lifeboat launching nearly impossible. What had started as a minor inconvenience, "Oh look, we've hit some ice," evolved into a geometric problem where the laws of gravity were working against everyone's survival interests. The crew discovered that launching lifeboats from a tilting ship required skills that weren't covered in their standard maritime training, which had apparently assumed that ships would remain horizontal during evacuations. The evolution of the situation revealed how inadequate the initial response had been. The first lifeboats were launched half-empty because crew members were following peacetime procedures that prioritize passenger comfort over passenger survival. As the night progressed and the situation became more desperate, the crew began filling lifeboats to capacity and beyond, which was either practical adaptation or evidence that emergency situations require people to abandon their normal standards of customer service. Second-generation effects included the breakdown of normal social hierarchies as survival became the only priority that mattered. Passengers who had been models of proper behavior during dinner service began fighting for lifeboat space, while crew members who had been trained to maintain order began making independent decisions about who deserved to survive. The carefully orchestrated class system that had governed every aspect of ship operations was replaced by a more primitive system based on proximity to lifeboats and willingness to ignore social conventions. The ship's physical deterioration created cascading problems that made evacuation increasingly difficult. The electrical systems began failing systematically, plunging the lower decks into darkness just when passengers needed light most desperately. The flooding caused the ship to settle deeper in the water, which brought the ocean closer to the remaining passengers, while making the lifeboats seem impossibly far away. Perhaps most significantly, the extended timeline of the disaster allowed everyone involved to experience the full range of human responses to impending doom. The initial calm gave way to concern. Concern gave way to worry. Worry gave way to panic. And panic gave way to the kind of desperate behavior that reveals what people are really like when their assumptions about civilization are proven wrong by a chunk of floating ice. As the night progressed, new figures emerged who would play crucial roles in determining who lived and who died. And their approaches differed dramatically from the original cast of characters who had been operating under the assumption that proper procedures and social etiquette could solve any problem, including the problem of a sinking ship. Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator, became the voice of the Titanic's final hours as he continued sending distress signals even as the radio room flooded around him. Bride's role differed from earlier players because he understood that normal communication protocols were inadequate for emergency situations where every minute counted. He abandoned the polite formalities of routine maritime communication in favor of increasingly desperate messages that captured the growing urgency of the situation. Bride survived, but only after being trapped under an overturned lifeboat and experiencing the kind of near-death adventure that would have been exciting if it weren't so likely to result in actual death. Thomas Andrews emerged as a tragic figure who spent his final hours trying to help passengers escape the floating monument to engineering overconfidence that he had designed. Andrews' contribution was his intimate knowledge of the ship's layout, which he used to guide passengers around the obstacles that his own design had inadvertently created. He was last seen in the first-class smoking room, having apparently concluded that there was no point in trying to escape from a disaster that he had helped create. Andrews represented the transition from confident designer to guilty survivor assistance coordinator. Wallace Hartley and his band members became the soundtrack to the disaster, providing musical accompaniment to the end of the world while demonstrating either incredible professional dedication or complete inability to read a room. Their approach differed from other crew members because they focused on passenger morale rather than passenger evacuation, which was either psychologically helpful or a massive misallocation of human resources, depending on your perspective. The ship's lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, became symbols of the human element in technological failure. Their specific contribution was spotting the iceberg 37 seconds before impact, which was either admirably quick observation or evidence that the ship's safety systems depended too heavily on human eyesight in situations where human eyesight was inadequate. Fleet survived and later testified about the disaster, providing first-hand accounts of what it was like to watch 1,500 people die because you couldn't see a chunk of ice quickly enough. John Phillips, the senior wireless operator, represented the old guard's commitment to procedure even during apocalyptic events. Phillips continued following normal communication protocols even as the ship sank around him, which was either admirable professionalism or evidence that some people will maintain customer service standards during the actual end of the world. Phillips died at his post, which made him either a hero or a victim of excessive dedication to his job description. These new players brought different approaches to crisis management that ranged from practical problem-solving to complete denial of reality. Their stories revealed how individuals could either adapt to changing circumstances or continue following normal procedures, even when those procedures were clearly inadequate for the situation at hand. But some problems persisted throughout the evacuation process, proving that certain human tendencies are so deeply ingrained that they continue even when continuing them is likely to result in death. The systematic exclusion of third-class passengers from lifeboats remained a constant throughout the night, demonstrating that class distinctions were more durable than the ship itself and would survive even when survival became questionable. For everyone involved, the communication problems that had contributed to the initial collision continued throughout the evacuation. The ship's officers struggled to coordinate lifeboat deployment, because they had never trained for emergency communications. During a disaster, and their normal chain of command was designed for routine operations rather than crisis management. Orders were confused, contradictory, or simply absent, which meant that crew members often had to improvise solutions to problems they had never encountered during their maritime education. New versions of old problems emerged as the evacuation progressed. The class system that had originally manifested as different dining rooms and accommodation standards now manifested as different evacuation priorities and survival opportunities. The same passengers who had been excluded from first-class amenities were now excluded from first-class lifeboat access, which suggested that social hierarchies were portable and could be adapted to any situation, including situations where maintaining those hierarchies would kill people. Cyclical patterns appeared as the night progressed. Each lifeboat launch followed the same sequence of confusion, delay, partial loading, and eventual deployment with fewer passengers than capacity allowed. The crew repeatedly made the same mistakes because they had no mechanism for learning from previous launches or communicating successful techniques to other officers. Each lifeboat became an individual experiment in emergency evacuation, with predictably inconsistent results. The ongoing issue of inadequate safety equipment became more apparent as the evacuation continued. The ship didn't have enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, which was legal under existing maritime regulations, but proved spectacularly inadequate when those regulations were tested by an actual emergency. The lifeboats that were available were often launched half-empty because crew members were prioritizing social distinctions over practical capacity, which meant that the inadequate safety equipment was being used even less effectively than its inadequate design allowed. Why certain issues proved intractable became clear as the night progressed. The fundamental problem wasn't mechanical failure or human error. It was systematic failure of planning, regulation, and social priorities. The maritime industry had designed safety systems that worked perfectly under normal conditions, but collapsed catastrophically during emergencies. The social systems that govern passenger treatment had prioritized comfort and convenience over survival and emergency preparedness. The crew's training had prepared them to operate a luxury liner, but not to evacuate a sinking ship, which meant that every aspect of the emergency response required improvisation by people who had never faced similar situations. The passengers' expectations had been shaped by marketing materials that promoted the ship as unsinkable, which meant that many people were psychologically unprepared for the possibility that their expensive tickets had purchased access to a floating death trap. These ongoing issues revealed that the Titanic disaster wasn't just about a ship hitting an iceberg. It was about systematic failures in regulation, design, training, and social priorities that made the disaster inevitable. Once the initial collision occurred, compared to other maritime disasters of the era, the Titanic's evacuation process was both more orderly and more deadly than typical ship emergencies, which suggests that the combination of social hierarchy and inadequate safety equipment created a unique form of systematic failure that was worse than simple chaos or panic. Earlier maritime disasters had typically involved smaller ships with simpler class systems, which meant that evacuation procedures were more straightforward and social. Distinctions were less likely to interfere with survival. The Titanic's size and elaborate social stratification created evacuation challenges that had never been encountered before, and the crew's response revealed how unprepared the maritime industry was for disasters involving floating cities rather than simple transportation vessels. What was unique about the Titanic disaster was the extended timeline that allowed social systems to influence survival outcomes. Most ship disasters happened quickly, which meant that survival was determined primarily by luck and proximity to safety equipment. The Titanic's slow sinking created time for systematic exclusion and social prioritization, which made the disaster more deadly for poor passengers, and more survivable for wealthy passengers than random chance would have produced. What was universal about the disaster was the tendency for safety regulations to lag behind technological advancement. The maritime industry had built increasingly large and complex ships while maintaining safety standards designed for smaller, simpler vessels. This pattern would repeat throughout the 20th century as industries developed new technologies, faster than they developed safety procedures for those technologies. Lessons that could be learned from the Titanic disaster included the importance of adequate safety equipment, the necessity of training crew members for emergency situations, and the danger of allowing social hierarchies to influence evacuation priorities. These lessons would eventually transform maritime safety regulations, but they came too late to save anyone aboard the Titanic. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for technological confidence to outpace safety preparation, the influence of social class on disaster outcomes, and the inadequacy of regulations written by the same industries they were supposed to regulate. The Titanic disaster became a template for understanding how technological progress could create new forms of systematic failure that were more deadly than the problems technology was supposed to solve. The comparative analysis revealed that the Titanic disaster wasn't an isolated accident. It was a predictable result of systematic problems that would continue causing disasters until regulations, training, and social priorities were fundamentally changed. By 2:05 a.m., approximately 2 hours and 25 minutes after the collision, the signs pointed to a major change that even the most optimistic passengers could no longer ignore. The Titanic was transitioning from luxury liner with minor flooding issues to vertical launching platform for an unscheduled deep-sea exploration. The ship's bow was now completely underwater, which was either a dramatic design modification or clear evidence that the marketing materials about unsinkability had been significantly overstated. The warning signs were becoming impossible to dismiss, even for people who had spent the previous 2 hours convincing themselves that a ship marketed as unsinkable couldn't possibly be sinking. The deck was tilting at an angle that made walking difficult and standing upright exercise in creative balance, while the remaining lifeboats were becoming increasingly difficult to launch because the davits were designed for horizontal ships, not diagonal ones. The ship's lights were beginning to flicker as the electrical system strained under the pressure of trying to provide power to a vessel that was gradually transforming from a ship into a submarine. What key players could see versus what they missed revealed the gap between technical knowledge and wishful thinking. Thomas Andrews had been warning for hours that the ship would sink, but many passengers and crew members had continued hoping that his professional assessment was overly pessimistic. Captain Smith had accepted the reality of the situation, but some officers were still following peacetime procedures, as if normal operations could somehow reverse the laws of physics. First-class passengers who had paid premium prices for their tickets seemed particularly resistant to accepting that their financial investment couldn't overcome basic engineering limitations. That resistance to inevitable change came from multiple sources, each more futile than the last. Some passengers refused to board lifeboats because they still believed the ship was safer than the small boats, which was either touching faith in naval architecture or evidence that people will cling to expensive mistakes even when those mistakes are actively killing them. Crew members continued trying to maintain normal service standards even as the ship's geometry made normal service physically impossible. The band was still playing, which was either admirably dedicated customer service or a perfect example of how people will continue following their job descriptions during the actual apocalypse. The ship's structure was beginning to show signs of stress that went beyond simple flooding. The Titanic was 882 feet long, and the increasing angle was creating leverage forces that the hull wasn't designed to withstand. Steel doesn't bend indefinitely, and the ship was approaching the point where structural failure would transform The disaster from a slow-motion evacuation into a rapid-motion demonstration of what happens when really big things break in half while people are still aboard them. The groaning sounds coming from deep within the ship suggested that the Titanic was preparing for its final performance, and it wasn't going to be a graceful conclusion. At 2:18 a.m., the Titanic reached the point where physics finally overruled engineering confidence, marketing claims, and passenger denial. The ship broke in half with a sound that survivors described as everything from thunder to the roar of 1,000 express trains, which suggests that either the ship's destruction was impressively loud or people experience catastrophic structural failure differently, depending on their proximity to the breaking point. The final major players in this terminal act included Chief Officer Henry Wilde, who continued trying to launch the last collapsible lifeboats even as the ship's deck became increasingly vertical. Captain Smith, who was last seen either swimming toward a lifeboat or going down with his ship, depending on which survivor account you believe. And Father Thomas Biles, who was giving last rites to passengers who had decided that if they were going to die, they might as well die with their spiritual paperwork in order. The dramatic final moments played out like a disaster movie directed by someone who had never heard of pacing or narrative restraint. First, the ship's lights went out, plunging the remaining passengers into darkness and adding a horror movie atmosphere to what was already a fairly horrific situation. Then the ship broke in half between the third and fourth funnels, creating two separate disasters instead of one, and proving that the Titanic was committed to overachieving even during its own destruction. The bow section, which was already completely underwater, immediately began its final descent to the ocean floor like a 400-foot steel bullet. The stern section, suddenly freed from the weight of the bow, briefly righted itself and floated for a few minutes before beginning its own descent. This gave the remaining passengers a brief moment of hope that maybe they could survive after all, followed by the crushing realization that hope was just another luxury item that the Titanic couldn't actually provide. The last attempts to preserve or change things included crew members trying to launch the final collapsible lifeboats from a deck that was becoming increasingly vertical, passengers jumping into the ocean and hoping for the best, and various individuals making peace with their gods while surrounded by what was essentially a floating monument to the failure of human planning and engineering confidence. Passengers watched in horror as their supposedly indestructible ship literally snapped like a pencil, which was either a sobering lesson about the limits of technology or proof that even the most expensive engineering projects can fail in spectacularly dramatic ways. The breaking of the ship created a sound that could be heard for miles, which meant that the Titanic's destruction was audible proof that something had gone very wrong with the whole unsinkable ship concept. The stern section's final moments were particularly dramatic as it tilted almost vertically before beginning its descent. Passengers who had managed to stay aboard this long found themselves clinging to railings while standing on what had been the ship's side, which was either an impressive demonstration of human tenacity or evidence that some people will continue trying to survive even in situations where survival has become geometrically impossible. Symbolic endpoints included the moment when the ship's final lights went out, marking the end of the Titanic's brief career as a luxury liner and the beginning of its permanent career as an underwater tourist attraction. The last wireless message sent from the ship was CQD CQD D MG Y MG Y followed by silence, which was either a poignant final communication or evidence that even during the apocalypse, people continue following communication protocols. The actual sinking of the stern section took only a few minutes, but those minutes contained enough terror and drama to fuel decades of disaster movies and maritime safety regulations. The Titanic's final dive to the ocean floor was swift and decisive, which was either merciful or a disappointing anticlimax after 2.5 hours of slow-motion disaster. The analysis of causes reveals that the Titanic sank because of a perfect storm of human arrogance, inadequate regulation, and the fundamental misconception that expensive engineering could overcome basic physics. The internal problems included a design philosophy that prioritized passenger impressions over passenger safety, a crew trained for luxury service rather than emergency management, and safety regulations written by the same industry that was supposed to be regulated by them. External pressures contributed to the disaster through competitive pressure to build larger, faster, and more luxurious ships without corresponding improvements in safety equipment or emergency procedures. The shipping industry was locked in a race to provide the most impressive passenger experience, which meant that safety considerations were secondary to marketing considerations. The North Atlantic shipping routes were becoming increasingly competitive, which encouraged ship operators to take risks that prioritize schedule adherence over passenger welfare. The role of individuals versus historical forces reveals how personal decisions could accelerate or mitigate the disaster, but couldn't prevent it once the fundamental design and regulatory failures had created the conditions for catastrophe. Captain Smith's decision to maintain full speed through an ice field was a personal choice, but it was a choice made within a system that rewarded risk-taking and penalized schedule delays. Thomas Andrews' design decisions were individual choices, but they were made within an industry that demanded impressive luxury features, regardless of their impact on emergency evacuation. What could have been done differently includes everything from better lifeboat capacity to improved crew training, to more conservative navigation policies, but the fundamental problem was systematic rather than individual. The maritime industry would have needed to completely restructure its priorities, regulations, and design philosophy to prevent the Titanic disaster, which would have required the kind of systematic change that typically only happens after disasters, rather than before them. The question of inevitability versus contingency is complicated because the specific details of the Titanic disaster were contingent. The ship might have missed the iceberg, the ice warnings might have been heeded, the collision might have caused less damage. But some form of major maritime disaster was probably inevitable given the industry's systematic prioritization of luxury over safety and the inadequacy of regulations that had been written by the people they were supposed to regulate. The disaster was the predictable result of an industry that had convinced itself that technological progress could eliminate natural risks without requiring corresponding improvements in safety procedures or emergency planning. The Titanic represented the logical conclusion of a design philosophy that treated safety as a luxury feature rather than a basic requirement, and that assumed that impressive engineering could substitute for adequate preparation. Historical forces that contributed to the disaster included the competitive pressure of the North Atlantic shipping industry, the regulatory capture that prevented adequate safety oversight, and the social hierarchies that made some passengers' lives more valuable than others. These forces created the conditions that made a disaster like the Titanic not just possible, but probable. Individual decisions could influence the specific details of how the disaster unfolded, but they couldn't overcome the systematic problems. That made the disaster inevitable once the fundamental assumptions about safety, technology, and regulation were tested by an actual emergency that exceeded the system's design parameters. The immediate aftermath was a floating graveyard populated by lifeboats, containing survivors who had just watched 1,500 people die because they had trusted marketing materials about unsinkable ships. The scene was surreal. Small boats scattered across the North Atlantic, filled with people wearing life jackets and evening wear, surrounded by debris from what had been the most advanced passenger ship ever built just a few hours earlier. Who stepped into the vacuum included the crew of the RMS Carpathia, which arrived at the disaster site about an hour and 40 minutes after the Titanic's final plunge and began the grim task of collecting survivors who had experienced the most expensive maritime disaster in history. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia became an instant hero for his ship's rescue efforts, which was either well-deserved recognition or proof that people become heroes simply by doing their jobs competently during disasters. Short-term consequences included 710 survivors and 1,514 deaths, though the exact numbers remain disputed because the passenger manifest was about as accurate as the ship's safety equipment. The immediate human cost was staggering, but the financial cost was also significant. The Titanic represented a massive investment that was now resting on the ocean floor, along with the passengers who had trusted their lives to it. Contemporary reactions range from shock to outrage to the kind of finger-pointing that typically follows disasters, where systematic failures become obvious only after people die. Newspapers began reporting the story as a tragedy of heroic passengers and crew members, which was either accurate reporting or an early example of how media coverage can focus on individual heroism while downplaying systematic failures. Attempts at revival or continuation were impossible because the ship was now 12,500 feet underwater, which was either too deep for practical salvage operations or proof that some mistakes are permanent regardless of how much money you're willing to spend to fix them. The legacy of the Titanic disaster shaped maritime law, technological development, and public attitudes toward progress in ways that transformed how the world approached the relationship between innovation and safety. The disaster essentially forced an entire industry to admit that their approach to passenger safety had been approximately as effective as using a colander as a life preserver, which led to regulatory changes that were both comprehensive and overdue by about 50 years. The specific influences on later developments included the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, which was created in 1914 specifically because the Titanic disaster had proven that existing maritime regulations were about as useful as chocolate teapots during actual emergencies. The convention required ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, which was apparently such a revolutionary concept that it required an international maritime disaster to make it seem reasonable. The regulations also mandated 24-hour radio watch, which addressed the problem of nearby ships missing distress calls because their radio operators had decided to call it a night. How later generations viewed the disaster evolved from a story of heroic sacrifice to a cautionary tale about technological hubris, depending on whether the people telling the story were trying to sell something or trying to prevent future disasters. The initial reaction focused on the brave behavior of wealthy passengers who went down with the ship like gentlemen, which was either inspiring storytelling or an early example of how media coverage can focus on the deaths of rich people while treating the deaths of poor people as background statistics. The myths versus realities that developed around the disaster included the persistent belief that the ship's band played "Nearer My God to Thee" as the ship sank, which may or may not be true but has become such an integral part of the story that correcting it would be like explaining that Santa Claus doesn't actually exist. Other myths include the idea that Captain Smith was a heroic figure who went down with his ship, rather than a professionally negligent ship's captain who ignored multiple ice warnings and maintained dangerous speed through a known ice field. Why? The disaster remained important rather than being forgotten like other maritime accidents was partly due to the passenger list, which included some of the wealthiest and most famous people in the world, and partly due to the scale of the disaster, which was so comprehensive that it couldn't be dismissed as bad luck or isolated incompetence. The Titanic disaster became a symbol of the dangers of overconfidence in technology, which made it relevant to every subsequent technological disaster from the Hindenburg to Chernobyl to the Challenger explosion. The disaster also remained important because it revealed systematic problems that went beyond maritime safety to include social inequality, regulatory capture, and the tendency for industries to prioritize profit over safety. These problems didn't disappear after the Titanic sank. They just migrated to other industries and other technologies, which meant that the Titanic disaster became a template for understanding how technological progress could create new forms of systematic failure. Academic study of the disaster has produced thousands of books, articles, and documentaries that analyze everything, from the metallurgy of the ship's rivets to the social dynamics of the evacuation process. This extensive scholarly attention suggests that either the disaster contains important lessons about human nature and technological development, or academics will study anything if given enough time and research funding. The disaster has become a case study in engineering ethics, crisis management, and the sociology of disaster, which means that people are still learning from the Titanic's failures more than a century after they occurred. Today, we can see echoes of the Titanic disaster in virtually every technological catastrophe that involves overconfident engineers, inadequate regulation, and the assumption that impressive technology can overcome basic safety considerations. The pattern of prioritizing innovation over safety, trusting marketing materials over engineering reality, and assuming that expensive systems are automatically safe systems has been repeated so consistently that the Titanic disaster might as well be a user's manual for how to create technological disasters in the modern era. The specific parallels include the 2008 financial crisis, which was caused by banks that were considered too big to fail until they failed anyway, proving that size and complexity don't automatically create stability any more than they created unsinkability for the Titanic. Financial institutions had created increasingly complex instruments, while maintaining safety regulations designed for simpler systems, which was essentially the same mistake that the maritime industry made when they built floating cities while maintaining safety standards designed for simple ships. The Challenger space shuttle disaster of 1986 followed the Titanic template almost perfectly. Engineers who raised safety concerns were overruled by managers who prioritized schedule adherence over passenger safety, leading to a disaster that was both predictable and preventable. The pattern of technical experts being ignored by administrative decision-makers was identical to the Titanic's crew ignoring ice warnings because maintaining schedule was considered more important than avoiding icebergs. The 2017 Equifax data breach revealed how companies could prioritize customer convenience over customer security, leading to systematic exposure of personal information that affected 147 million people. The breach was caused by the same kind of overconfidence in technology and inadequate attention to safety procedures that characterized the Titanic disaster, except instead of people drowning in the North Atlantic, they drowned in identity theft and financial fraud. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes of 2018 and 2019 demonstrated how companies could prioritize marketing considerations over safety considerations, leading to aircraft that were marketed as improvements over existing models, but were actually less safe due to design compromises that prioritize pilot training costs over flight safety. The crashes killed 346 people and grounded an entire aircraft model, which was either tragic proof that the lessons of the Titanic hadn't been learned or evidence that the same systematic problems that sank the Titanic are still sinking things in the 21st century. What hasn't changed about human nature includes the tendency to trust authority figures who claim that new technology is inherently safer than old technology, the willingness to accept marketing claims that sound too good to be true, and a assumption that regulations written by industries are adequate to protect consumers from those same industries. People are still willing to board vehicles, use systems, and trust institutions based on impressive claims about safety and reliability, without investigating whether those claims are supported by adequate testing and regulation. Similar patterns in different contexts include the tendency for technological disasters to be followed by regulatory changes that would have prevented the disaster if they had been implemented beforehand. The focus on individual heroism rather than systematic failure during disaster coverage, and the assumption that technological progress automatically represents improvement rather than simply change. These patterns suggest that either humans are incapable of learning from technological disasters, or they're capable of learning, but not capable of applying those lessons to prevent future disasters. Lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of adequate regulation for new technologies, the necessity of safety standards that anticipate failure rather than assuming success, and the danger of allowing industries to regulate themselves. The Titanic disaster teaches us that impressive technology is not automatically safe technology, that expensive systems can fail catastrophically, and that systematic problems require systematic solutions rather than individual heroism. These lessons are particularly relevant for emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and genetic engineering, which are being developed by industries that are making the same claims about safety and reliability that the maritime industry made about the Titanic. Even now, the Titanic disaster influences everything from maritime safety regulations to popular entertainment to political discourse about the relationship between technological progress and human welfare. The disaster has become a cultural touchstone that represents the dangers of overconfidence in technology and the tendency for impressive innovations to create new forms of catastrophic failure. Academic study of the disaster continues to produce new insights about everything from the metallurgy of early 20th century shipbuilding to the social psychology of disaster response. Researchers have used the Titanic as a case study for understanding how organizations make decisions under pressure, how social hierarchies influence survival outcomes during emergencies, and how technological systems can fail in ways that their designers never anticipated. The disaster has become a template for analyzing other technological catastrophes, which suggests that either the lessons of the Titanic are universally applicable or academics will use any excuse to study disasters that popular culture has transformed the Titanic disaster into entertainment that ranges from serious historical drama to romantic fantasy, with varying degrees of accuracy and educational value. The 1997 James Cameron film created a version of the disaster that prioritized emotional impact over historical accuracy, which was either effective storytelling or proof that people prefer romantic fiction to uncomfortable truths about social inequality and technological failure. The film's success demonstrated that people are still fascinated by the disaster more than 80 years after it occurred, which suggests that the story contains universal themes about human nature, technological hubris, and the fragility of civilization. Political discourse continues to use the Titanic as a metaphor for everything from economic policy to climate change to pandemic response, which means that the disaster has become a shorthand way of describing any situation where overconfidence in systems leads to catastrophic failure. Politicians who want to criticize their opponents' policies routinely compare those policies to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, which is either an effective rhetorical device or evidence that political discourse will use any metaphor. That sounds dramatic. Why people still care about the Titanic disaster more than a century after it occurred is partly due to the universal themes. It represents the danger of overconfidence, the fragility of technological systems, and the tendency for social hierarchies to become deadly during emergencies. These themes remain relevant because humans continue to create impressive technologies without adequately considering their failure modes, continue to trust institutions that prioritize profit over safety, and continue to organize societies in ways that make some lives more valuable than others during disasters. The legacy of the Titanic disaster shaped maritime law, technological development, and public attitudes toward progress in ways that transformed how the world approached the relationship between innovation and safety. The disaster essentially forced an entire industry to admit that their approach to passenger safety had been approximately as effective as using a colander as a life preserver, which led to regulatory changes that were both comprehensive and overdue by about 50 years. The specific influences on later developments included the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, which was created in 1914 specifically because the Titanic disaster had proven that existing maritime regulations were about as useful as chocolate teapots during actual emergencies. The convention required ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, which was apparently such a revolutionary concept that it required an international maritime disaster to make it seem reasonable. The regulations also mandated 24-hour radio watch, which addressed the problem of nearby ships missing distress calls because their radio operators had decided to call it a night. How later generations viewed the disaster evolved from a story of heroic sacrifice to a cautionary tale about technological hubris, depending on whether the people telling the story were trying to sell something or trying to prevent future disasters. The initial reaction focused on the brave behavior of wealthy passengers who went down with the ship like gentlemen, which was either inspiring storytelling or an early example of how media coverage can focus on the deaths of rich people, while treating the deaths of poor people as background statistics. The myths versus realities that developed around the disaster included the persistent belief that the ship's band played "Nearer My God to Thee" as the ship sank, which may or may not be true, but has become such an integral part of the story that correcting it would be like explaining that Santa Claus doesn't actually exist. Other myths include the idea that Captain Smith was a heroic figure who went down with his ship, rather than a professionally negligent ship's captain who ignored multiple ice warnings and maintained dangerous speed through a known ice field. Why? The disaster remained important rather than being forgotten like other maritime accidents was partly due to the passenger list, which included some of the wealthiest and most famous people in the world, and partly due to the scale of the disaster, which was so comprehensive that it couldn't be dismissed as bad luck or isolated incompetence. The Titanic disaster became a symbol of the dangers of overconfidence in technology, which made it relevant to every subsequent technological disaster from the Hindenburg to Chernobyl to the Challenger explosion. The disaster also remained important because it revealed systematic problems that went beyond maritime safety to include social inequality, regulatory capture, and the tendency for industries to prioritize profit over safety. These problems didn't disappear after the Titanic sank. They just migrated to other industries and other technologies, which meant that the Titanic disaster became a template for understanding how technological progress could create new forms of systematic failure. Academic study of the disaster has produced thousands of books, articles, and documentaries that analyze everything from the metallurgy of the ship's rivets to the social dynamics of the evacuation process. This extensive scholarly attention suggests that either the disaster contains important lessons about human nature and technological development, or academics will study anything if given enough time and research funding. The disaster has become a case study in engineering ethics, crisis management, and the sociology of disaster, which means that people are still learning from the Titanic's failures more than a century after they occurred. Today, we can see echoes of the Titanic disaster in virtually every technological catastrophe that involves overconfident engineers, inadequate regulation, and the assumption that impressive technology can overcome basic safety considerations. The pattern of prioritizing innovation over safety, trusting marketing materials over engineering reality, and assuming that expensive systems are automatically safe systems has been repeated so consistently that the Titanic disaster might as well be a user's manual for how to create technological disasters in the modern era. The specific parallels include the 2008 financial crisis, which was caused by banks that were considered too big to fail until they failed anyway, proving that size and complexity don't automatically create stability, any more than they created unsinkability for the Titanic. Financial institutions had created increasingly complex instruments, while maintaining safety regulations designed for simpler systems, which was essentially the same mistake that the maritime industry made when they built floating cities while maintaining safety standards designed for simple ships. The Challenger space shuttle disaster of 1986 followed the Titanic template almost perfectly. Engineers who raised safety concerns were overruled by managers who prioritized schedule adherence over passenger safety, leading to a disaster that was both predictable and preventable. The pattern of technical experts being ignored by administrative decision-makers was identical to the Titanic's crew ignoring ice warnings because maintaining schedule was considered more important than avoiding icebergs. The 2017 Equifax data breach revealed how companies could prioritize customer convenience over customer security, leading to systematic exposure of personal information that affected 147 million people. The breach was caused by the same kind of overconfidence in technology and inadequate attention to safety procedures that characterized the Titanic disaster. Except instead of people drowning in the North Atlantic, they drowned in identity theft and financial fraud. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes of 2018 and 2019 demonstrated how companies could prioritize marketing considerations over safety considerations, leading to aircraft that were marketed as improvements over existing models, but were actually less safe due to design compromises that prioritize pilot training costs over flight safety. The crashes killed 346 people and grounded an entire aircraft model, which was either tragic proof that the lessons of the Titanic hadn't been learned or evidence that the same systematic problems that sank the Titanic are still sinking things. In the 21st century, what hasn't changed about human nature includes the tendency to trust authority figures who claim that new technology is inherently safer than old technology, the willingness to accept marketing claims that sound too good to be true, and the assumption that regulations written by industries are adequate to protect consumers from those same industries. People are still willing to board vehicles, use systems, and trust institutions based on impressive claims about safety and reliability, without investigating whether those claims are supported by adequate testing and regulation. Similar patterns in different contexts include the tendency for technological disasters to be followed by regulatory changes that would have prevented the disaster if they had been implemented beforehand. The focus on individual heroism rather than systematic failure during disaster coverage, and the assumption that technological progress automatically represents improvement rather than simply change. These patterns suggest that either humans are incapable of learning from technological disasters, or they're capable of learning, but not capable of applying those lessons to prevent future disasters. Lessons for contemporary issues include the importance of adequate regulation for new technologies, the necessity of safety standards that anticipate failure rather than assuming success, and the danger of allowing industries to regulate themselves. The Titanic disaster teaches us that impressive technology is not automatically safe technology, that expensive systems can fail catastrophically, and that systematic problems require systematic solutions rather than individual heroism. These lessons are particularly relevant for emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and genetic engineering, which are being developed by industries that are making the same claims about safety and reliability that the maritime industry made about the Titanic. Even now, the Titanic disaster influences everything from maritime safety regulations to popular entertainment to political discourse about the relationship between technological progress and human welfare. The disaster has become a cultural touchstone that represents the dangers of overconfidence in technology and the tendency for impressive innovations to create new forms of catastrophic failure. Academic study of the disaster continues to produce new insights about everything from the metallurgy of early 20th century shipbuilding to the social psychology of disaster response. Researchers have used the Titanic as a case study for understanding how organizations make decisions under pressure, how social hierarchies influence survival outcomes during emergencies, and how technological systems can fail in ways that their designers never anticipated. The disaster has become a template for analyzing other technological catastrophes, which suggests that either the lessons of the Titanic are universally applicable, or academics will use any excuse to study disasters that popular culture has transformed the Titanic disaster into entertainment that ranges from serious historical drama to romantic fantasy, with varying degrees of accuracy and educational value. The 1997 James Cameron film created a version of the disaster that prioritized emotional impact over historical accuracy, which was either effective storytelling or proof that people prefer romantic fiction to uncomfortable truths about social inequality and technological failure. The film's success demonstrated that people are still fascinated by the disaster more than 80 years after it occurred, which suggests that the story contains universal themes about human nature, technological hubris, and the fragility of civilization. Political discourse continues to use the Titanic as a metaphor for everything from economic policy to climate change to pandemic response, which means that the disaster has become a shorthand way of describing any situation where overconfidence in systems leads to catastrophic failure. Politicians who want to criticize their opponents' policies routinely compare those policies to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, which is either an effective rhetorical device or evidence that political discourse will use any metaphor. That sounds dramatic. Why people still care about the Titanic disaster more than a century after it occurred is partly due to the universal themes. It represents the danger of overconfidence, the fragility of technological systems, and the tendency for social hierarchies to become deadly during emergencies. These themes remain relevant because humans continue to create impressive technologies without adequately considering their failure modes, continue to trust institutions that prioritize profit over safety, and continue to organize societies in ways that make some lives more valuable than others during disasters.